Lecture 2, balance sheet. So last lecture we went over how money is fundamentally a credible promise. So here we'll delve into that a little further. So every promise has two sides. There is the promiser and the promisee. So for our next definition, we are going to define these two sides. So sorry, let me call this definition 1.2. So the promiser side of money is called the liability. And conversely, the promisee, so the one being promised, is the asset. So these two are the fundamentals of what is commonly referred to as the balance sheet accounting method. This seems highly technical, but I think it's worth going over some terms here. So the sort of the collection of all assets, which I will call capital A, and all liabilities, which I'll refer to as capital L, of a given entity, is called the balance sheet. And so I'll use this notation A and L for a particular individual's balance sheet. So typically how we represent this is we'll draw a table like this. So on the top I'll say who owns this. So this might be you, right, individually. I'll draw a dash line in the middle here. And then on the right side, we have the liabilities. On the left side, we have the assets. And similarly over here, we might have, for example, the bank. And then the bank also has sort of assets and liabilities. And this is typically how we would represent it. So, for example, your asset might be your mortgage. And then on the bank side, this would be actually on an asset. Well, for you, it's a liability. For you, it's your liability because you're paying payment to the bank, and for the bank, it's an asset because it's a piece of paper that entitles him, or the banker, to a payment. Just some other notations. I'm going to sort of this fancy A. I'll refer to all. Or sort of more accurately, the universe of all assets, and this fancy L, universe of all liabilities. And this is just the union, right? The union of A is the union of all assets over all individuals. And similarly for this fancy L, right? Okay, so some more definitions. We are on definition 1.4. So equity is defined as the assets, the magnitude of assets of a company or individual, minus the magnitude of their liabilities. And then another definition here, 1.5, leverage. So actually, I'll just define this as E, equity. Leverage, there are many definitions about leverage, but I'll use this one, which is defined as your equity over the size of your liabilities. So, oh, sorry. That I have that inverted. Your leverage is the inverse of that. So it is the size of your liabilities over the size of your equity. So if you are an individual that's not in debt, you have no liabilities, you presumably have some equity, so your leverage ratio is zero. You're 0% levered. And you can speak of an entity with a leverage ratio of higher than one if they're if, for example, they have 1.1, a bank, right, has 1.1 billion in assets, 1 billion in, let me just write this down. So if your assets is 1.1 billion US dollars, and then your liabilities is 1 billion US dollars, then your equity is going to be 100 million, right? And then your leverage ratio is going to be 10. Just as a quick example here. All right. So, lemma 1.6. Okay, for all individual leverages in the entire leverage universe, so for any liability in the entire universe of all liabilities, there exists an asset in the entire universe of assets. So in other words, what this lemma states is that for every thing that is owed, someone holds the opposite side as an asset. So what are some examples? We mentioned above a mortgage. So mortgage debt is a liability for homeowners, but obviously is an asset for banks. Okay. And then just erase this. Similarly, government debt is a liability for government, but an asset for investors. Okay. What are some other examples? Bonds, sort of corporate bonds, are a liability, right, for corporations, and an asset, once again, for investors. So you kind of get the idea here. So basically, people love to speak about government debt, United States government, some $1 trillion in debt. And the important thing to realize is that ultimately there is another side to this. You're not just loaning to the ether. Someone has the other side. Someone has this as an asset. Someone is definitionally wealthy, right? At least someone has a larger asset sheet than because of your debt. And sort of this representation above, the reason why I drew it like this as two different balance sheets of two different entities is so that the liability side over here matches with the asset side over here. And the point of this being that across this dotted line is actually the mirror image of a particular promise. So in this case, it's a mortgage, but it similarly could be a government bond or a corporate bond or any other sort of other liability. So that's lemma 1.6. So now I guess one thing to sort of ask yourself is what is the case for the converse? Like, consider the converse of this. For every asset, is there actually in fact a liability somewhere. So I guess question, like, is it true that for all assets in the universe of assets, does there exist a liability in the universe of liabilities? And I think so. The first thing you might think of is obviously yes. So you can think of, you would say I have money in my own bank, and that's my asset, and no one else has a liability for that. So let's call this checkings account, your checkings account. But of course, if you watched the previous video, you already know this is not quite true. So in the balance sheet view, this is you. This is your let's actually do it this way. Your checkings account is in fact not. Your checkings account is an asset for you. So I'll put you on the right hand side. You're an asset, and then here checking account of some amount of money. But actually, what this is really a liability on the bank, as we discussed last time. So the bank is liable, has sort of given you a claim on it. If your checking account has $1,000, the bank has a liability of $1,000 if you sort of request it through an ATM or through a wire transfer. The bank actually has to come up with that money. So under this view, the checking account, does actually have a corresponding liability. And then the next thing you might think of, then, well, okay, checking account, that might be the case. What about cash? Cold, hard cash. Isn't this a pure asset? And at first, that might seem like it's the case because there's no bank in which you can sort of claim something here, and you might even think that once upon a time, cash was not a pure asset under the gold standard. Under the gold standard, cash was not a pure asset because at any point you could demand an equivalent sum of gold for your cash. And in that sense, for every outstanding dollar in cash you had, the central bank would have to hold an equivalent amount of gold. So the Bretton Woods gold standard was $35, which is equal to 1 ounce of gold. So under this view, you would have a balance sheet system that looks like this, where you are over here, you have, let's say, $3,500 of cash. And what this looks like is the central bank would need to have 100 ounces of gold. And that's how it was, but Bretton Woods ended, and there is no gold convertibility anymore. So maybe you would say, actually, now, post-Bretton Woods, or let's say post-gold standard, what is the liability? And this is a really good question. I think most common wisdom would say that cash is a pure asset because we live under a fiat system, which is what the post-gold standard system is called. But in actuality, the right way to think about cash is that the central bank still actually has a liability here. So let me draw these L's and A's. The central bank still has a liability, but the central bank's liability is not 100 ounces in gold or whatever gold it is. What it actually is it has a liability of $3,500 of value. And hold on a sec. What does this mean? The central bank itself is not a market participant. It does not own factories. It does not produce goods. It does not, provide people housing or anything that they need. The central bank is a completely non is a completely is purely a financial actor. So what does this mean that the central bank actually has a liability of $3,500 of value? What it means is that the central bank needs to manage the money, like dollars in circulation, so in a way such that everyone's cash will always be generically redeemable for the same amounts worth of value. And okay, so that sounds like a bit of a tautology, but what this effectively means is that the central bank, one of the central bank's primary mission is to control inflation. So if you ever watch Jerome Powell speak, you can look up on YouTube right now or Google the March FOMC meetings. Every time they speak, every single time without fail, they will mention the dual mandate, which is full employment and price stability. He will never fail to mention this dual mandate every time he talks in an official setting. And the central bank's primary liability is to make sure that the holders of dollars can obtain the equivalent amount of those dollars in value. And what that really means is price stability. Price stability is basically things that people need, goods and services, do not rise in price substantially over a given period of time. So concretely, they've set this 2% inflation target. And I think that, one way of looking at this is price stability. The other way of looking at this, so the inverted way of looking at this is that the real goal is to preserve dollar value. Right. Under one view, it's the value of goods and services in dollars should not change too radically. The other view is that the value of the dollar itself should not change too, in terms of goods and services, should not change too radically. So really, when the central bank tries to reach 2% inflation, when they say they want price stability, what they're really saying is they're trying to preserve the value of the dollar, and they're trying to uphold their liability, this liability of making sure that everyone that holds dollars is able to obtain a dollar's worth of value. So the dollar, cash and checking accounts are both assets that do have a corresponding liability. Are there any assets that don't have a corresponding liability? Well, I think there are, and I will just list this now sort of as an axiom. Axiom 1.7, that sort of pure assets exist. And I think this is quite, there's no way to prove it, but my sort of like go-to examples here are like farmland, commodities directly, I think, are assets. They have use value. Corn, food, I think, is ultimately an asset. It has very, very real use value. Natural endowments, I think, also count to a certain degree, depending on the legal system. I think so. These pure assets exist, and no one really holds the liability. It has to be said that we can't really prove this. It's sort of a matter of philosophy. So you can imagine someone that would say, "Oh, actually, these assets aren't pure assets because the person holding the liability is God, right? So God gave us land, God gave us good weather, and God causes crops to grow and whatnot. That's a philosophical view, but in this case with for the purpose of this series, we just like to consider these as pure assets and think of them as there's no one holding the other side. Okay, so finally, let's go back to sort of consequences of lemma 1.7. That, if you forgot, lemma 1.6 rather, that all liabilities have a corresponding asset. The consequence of this is that all players seek balance sheet stability. In other words, they want their assets to be larger than their liabilities. And the reason why they want this is because if it's not true, if your liabilities are greater than your assets, then the counterparty, the side that holds the liability, the other side of the liability, will begin to doubt your creditworthiness, your stability, and the fundamental deal breaks down. Because once again, from lecture 1, we learned that money is a credible promise for something else. All of these people holding all the counterparties holding the asset side of these liabilities are always assessing the risk of default from the other side. And if the risk of default is too high, then it's basically the deal is off, essentially. It can no longer be trusted, and they'll try to get out of their positions as quickly as possible. So in order to prevent that collapse of confidence, all players will want to seek this balance sheet stability. They want to maintain positive equity, and they want to make sure that their debtors, or rather their creditors, do not pull out. So that's sort of the conclusion from this part of the video. Yeah, and then once again, to end, there is a verse that I would like to read, which I have in my notes here, which is Luke 35-36. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful.